There is a city in the Middle East where Jewish people have lived for over 2,500 years, where Persian kings once saved the Jewish people from annihilation, where ancient alliances were forged in the desert sands of history. But once, not so long ago, Iran and Israel were allies. Today, these two nations stand at the edge of open war. Nuclear weapons, proxy armies, cyber attacks are invisible to the naked eye, assassinations in broad daylight, a rivalry that holds the fate of the entire Middle East, perhaps the entire world, in its hands. How did the world arrive at this moment? And what happens next could change history forever. They don't share a border. They don't share a language. They don't share a religion. Between them lie hundreds of miles and half a dozen other nations. And yet, the rivalry between the Islamic Republic of Iran and the State of Israel has become one of the most dangerous, most consequential, and most misunderstood conflicts on the planet. To understand what this rivalry is today, you first have to understand what it was and what it could have been, because this is not a story that begins with hatred. It begins with something far more surprising. It begins with friendship. Today, Iran funds, arms, and directs a network of militant groups that encircle Israel on every side. It has called for Israel's elimination. It has launched direct missile strikes on Israeli soil. It is, by most measures, racing toward a nuclear bomb. And Israel, a nation of fewer than 10 million people, has responded in kind, with covert operations, with cyber warfare, with strikes deep inside Iranian territory, with a simple iron doctrine: they will not allow Iran to go nuclear, no matter what it takes. This is a story of two nations that were once partners and became each other's greatest enemy. It is a story of revolution, ideology, betrayal, and blood, of decisions made in secret rooms that changed the fate of millions. Two ancient civilizations, two proud peoples, one catastrophic falling out. This is how it happened. To understand the modern conflict, you have to travel back, not decades, but millennia. Over 2,500 years ago, the Persian Empire was the greatest superpower on earth, and in the year 539 BCE, a Persian king named Cyrus the Great conquered Babylon and made one of the most remarkable decisions in ancient history. He freed the Jewish people from captivity. He allowed them to return to their homeland. He funded the rebuilding of their temple in Jerusalem. The Bible calls him the Messiah, the Anointed One, a non-Jewish king venerated in Jewish scripture as a liberator. For thousands of years, Jewish communities thrived across Persia. In medieval times, Persia was home to one of the world's most vibrant Jewish cultures. The Book of Esther, read every year at the Jewish festival of Purim, is set in the Persian court. The very fabric of Jewish history is woven through with Persia. This is the deep, layered history that makes the modern rivalry so jarring. Iran and Israel's story is not a story of ancient enemies. It is a story of ancient neighbors whose relationship was shattered in a single decade. When Israel was founded in 1948, the reaction across the Arab world was immediate and violent. Egypt, Jordan, Syria, Iraq, and other Arab nations attacked the newborn state within hours of its declaration of independence. The resulting war was existential for Israel, and it set the template for Israel's strategic thinking for generations to come. Israel's first prime minister, David Ben-Gurion, understood the problem with brutal clarity. Israel was a small Jewish state surrounded by Arab nations that did not accept its right to exist. To survive, Israel would need partners, not necessarily friends, partners, nations that shared strategic interests even if they didn't share values. Enter Iran. In the 1950s, Iran was ruled by Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, a modernizing pro-Western monarch with a deep suspicion of Arab nationalism and Soviet communism. He had no interest in the Arab-Israeli conflict. He was highly interested in Israeli technology, intelligence, and military expertise. And so began one of the most extraordinary and most secret alliances of the Cold War era. Ben-Gurion called it the periphery doctrine. If Israel were surrounded by hostile Arab states, it would seek alliances with the non-Arab nations on the periphery of the Arab world: Turkey, Ethiopia, and above all, Iran. nations that shared Israel's interest in containing Arab nationalism and Soviet influence. Throughout the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, Israel and Iran built something remarkable: an intelligence partnership, a military partnership, an economic partnership. Israeli military advisors trained Iranian soldiers. Israeli engineers helped build Iranian infrastructure. Iranian oil flowed through a secret pipeline to Israel, fueling the Israeli economy for decades. Israel's intelligence agency, the Mossad, and Iran's feared secret police, SAVAK, worked together to monitor Soviet activity and suppress shared enemies. They shared intelligence, they shared training, they shared secrets. By any measure, this was one of the closest strategic partnerships in the Middle East. Two nations that should have had no particular connection, bound together by common interest and common threat. Then came 1979, and everything fell apart. The Iranian Revolution of 1979 was one of the most seismic political events of the 20th century. In the space of a single year, a modern, secular monarchy was swept away, replaced by an Islamic republic built on a radical new ideology, led by a religious scholar who had spent 15 years in exile and who had a very clear view of Israel. Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini had called Israel a cancer for years. He called Zionism, the movement for Jewish statehood, a tool of American imperialism. He declared that Israel had no right to exist, and one of his first acts after seizing power was to sever all ties with the Jewish state, dramatically, publicly, and permanently. The Israeli embassy in Tehran was handed over to the PLO. The Israeli flag was torn down. Decades of quiet partnership gone overnight. For Israel, it was a strategic catastrophe. Their most important non-Arab ally, their oil supplier, their intelligence partner, transformed in weeks into an ideological enemy calling for their destruction. Then came the Iran-Iraq War. In 1980, Saddam Hussein's Iraq invaded Iran. 8 years of devastating, grinding warfare followed. Over 1 million people died. And in this war, the world saw something strange and contradictory about the Israel-Iran relationship. Even as Khomeini denounced Israel as the enemy, Israel quietly supplied weapons to Iran. Not out of love, out of cold calculation. Iraq, under Saddam Hussein, was seen as a greater immediate threat to Israel. Iran and Iraq fighting each other was, in Israel's strategic calculation, not the worst outcome. So spare parts for American weapons the Shah had bought, ammunition, intelligence. Flowing quietly from Israel to Iran, even as Iranian leaders screamed about Zionist genocide. In the mid-1980s, this would spiral into the Iran-Contra affair, a scandal that nearly brought down the Reagan administration, involving secret American arms sales to Iran, facilitated in part by Israel. The Middle East, it turned out, was always more complicated than the headlines suggested. The real turning point came in Lebanon. In 1982, Israel invaded Lebanon to destroy PLO bases in the south. What they got instead was something far more dangerous, the birth of Hezbollah. Iran's Revolutionary Guards deployed to Lebanon's Bekaa Valley. They trained, funded, and ideologically shaped a new Shia militant organization, Hezbollah, the Party of God, built from the ground up to be Iran's weapon against Israel, a weapon that would still be firing rockets into Israeli cities 40 years later. Hezbollah carried out suicide bombings that killed hundreds of American and French peacekeepers in Beirut in 1983. It kidnapped and killed Western hostages throughout the 1980s. And it became the model for everything Iran would build afterward, a proxy force that could attack Israel's enemies while giving Tehran plausible deniability. The 1990s brought the Oslo Accords, a brief, fragile moment of hope for the Middle East. But in Tehran, there was no hope, only strategy. Iran actively worked to destroy the Oslo peace process. It funded Hamas, the Palestinian Islamist movement, and encouraged attacks designed to derail negotiations between Israel and the Palestinians. Every bus bombing in Jerusalem, every market explosion in Tel Aviv. Iran was not pulling the trigger, but Iran was providing the bullets, the training, and the ideology. Analysts would later call this the axis of resistance, Iran at its center, Hezbollah, Hamas, Islamic Jihad, the Houthis in Yemen, Shia militias in Iraq, all connected to Tehran, all pointed in one way or another at Israel. And then came the nuclear question. The issue that transformed a regional rivalry into a global crisis. In 2002, an Iranian opposition group revealed that Iran had been secretly constructing nuclear facilities for almost 2 decades, hidden from the world, built underground, designed to enrich uranium far beyond what civilian energy programs require. For Israel, this was not an arms race, this was an existential threat. A nation that called openly for Israel's destruction, pursuing the weapon capable of delivering it. The conflict between Iran and Israel has another face, one that doesn't appear on news broadcasts, one fought not with missiles but with code, not with soldiers but with scientists in laboratories, a shadow war waged in the digital realm and on the streets of foreign cities, one of the most sophisticated covert conflicts in modern history. In 2010, engineers at Iran's Natanz nuclear facility noticed something wrong. The centrifuges, the machines used to enrich uranium, were spinning too fast, then too slow, malfunctioning in ways that made no sense. Metal was tearing itself apart. Progress was being destroyed from the inside. The cause, investigators would discover, was a computer virus unlike anything the world had ever seen. It became known as Stuxnet, and it was, according to virtually every credible intelligence and cybersecurity expert who has studied it, the first known deployment of a cyber weapon to cause physical destruction. Stuxnet was almost certainly a joint operation between the United States and Israel. A digital missile launched via a USB drive specifically designed to sabotage a single facility in a single country containing a single very specific model of centrifuge. It set back Iran's nuclear program by an estimated 2 years, and it opened a new chapter in the history of warfare, one where the most powerful weapons have no weight, no sound, and leave no fingerprints. But the shadow war was not only fought with code. Between 2010 and 2012, a series of Iranian nuclear scientists were killed in targeted assassinations. Car bombs, motorcycles pull up alongside vehicles and attach magnetic charges to the doors before speeding away. The operations bore the hallmarks of the Mossad. Iran attributed the killings to Israel and the United States. Israel declined to comment. The scientists Masoud Ali Mohammadi, Majid Shahriari, Dariush Rezai, and Mustafa Ahmadi Roshan became martyrs in Iran, and their deaths accelerated rather than slowed Iranian determination to proceed. Simultaneously, Israel was running a global interdiction campaign, intercepting weapons shipments from Iran to Hezbollah and other proxy groups. Ships boarded in the Mediterranean and the Red Sea, weapons caches destroyed in Sudan, convoys struck in Syria. Over the course of more than 2 decades, Israel carried out hundreds of airstrikes in Syria alone, targeting Iranian weapons transfers, Iranian military infrastructure, and Iranian-backed militias. Iran, meanwhile, was running its own covert operations. In 2012, Iranian-backed operatives were implicated in attempted bombings targeting Israeli diplomats in India, Georgia, Thailand, and Azerbaijan, all on the same day. The operations were disrupted, mostly, but the message was clear: no Israeli target anywhere in the world was beyond Iran's reach. And then there was the Amia bombing of 1994, still one of the deadliest terrorist attacks in the history of Latin America. The Amia Jewish Community Center in Buenos Aires was destroyed by a massive car bomb. 85 people are dead, hundreds wounded, after decades of investigation. Argentine prosecutors formally accused Iran of ordering the attack, Hezbollah of executing it. The case became a diplomatic crisis that stretched across continents, ensnaring presidents, intelligence agencies, and international courts. The victims, most of them ordinary Jewish Argentines, are still waiting for justice. These are the dimensions of this conflict that never make the front pages. The quiet operations, the disappeared scientists, the intercepted ships, the digital sabotage running invisibly through nuclear machinery. This is a war that has been quietly raging for decades. long before the missiles started flying in open sight. It would be easy to think of the Iran-Israel conflict as a regional problem, a quarrel between two nations in a turbulent corner of the world, relevant mainly to the people who live there. It would also be dangerously wrong. The Strait of Hormuz, the narrow channel between Iran and the Arabian Peninsula, is the most strategically important waterway on Earth. Nearly a third of all oil traded by sea passes through it. When tensions between Iran and Israel spike, oil prices spike with them. When Iran threatens to close the strait, as it has done repeatedly, the economies of Europe, Asia, and the Americas tremble. In April 2024, when Iran launched its first ever direct military attack on Israeli soil, over 300 drones and missiles fired at Israel, oil markets surged within hours. Gold prices jumped. The ripple effects were felt in London, Tokyo, and Sao Paulo before sunrise. Israel's Iron Dome and allied air defenses intercepted the overwhelming majority of the incoming projectiles. But the significance was not in the damage, it was in the precedent. For the first time in history, Iran had fired directly at Israeli territory. A threshold had been crossed. A line in the sand had been erased. The proxy network Iran has built around Israel has transformed the security landscape of the entire Middle East. Hezbollah in Lebanon, with over 100,000 missiles pointed at Israel, is considered by many analysts to be more heavily armed than most European national armies. The Houthis in Yemen have attacked shipping lanes in the Red Sea, strangling global trade routes. Hamas in Gaza triggered the most devastating conflict in the region in decades when it attacked Israel on October 7, 2023. On that morning, Hamas launched the deadliest attack on Jewish people since the Holocaust. Over 1,200 Israelis were killed, 250 taken hostage in Gaza. Israel's response, a devastating military campaign in Gaza, caused massive civilian casualties and triggered a global political crisis that divided governments, universities, and societies around the world. The Iran-Israel rivalry did not cause October 7th alone. But Iran had spent years funding, training, and arming Hamas. The weapons, the training, the strategic direction to attack Israel when it appeared distracted. Iranian fingerprints were on the ideology and infrastructure that made the attack possible, even if the decision to strike was Hamas's own. The nuclear question remains the most terrifying dimension of the conflict's global implications. As of 2024, Iran has enriched uranium to 60% purity, within a short technical step of weapons grade, 90%. The International Atomic Energy Agency has assessed that Iran has accumulated enough enriched uranium to build, if it chose, multiple nuclear weapons. The time required, what nuclear analysts call breakout time, has shrunk from over a year to a matter of weeks. If Iran develops a nuclear bomb, Saudi Arabia has stated it will seek one too. Turkey and Egypt may follow. A nuclear-armed Middle East, the nightmare scenario that global security experts have warned about for decades, would become real. The Non-Proliferation Treaty, the architecture of nuclear arms control built after Hiroshima and Nagasaki, could effectively collapse. This is why the world watches this conflict so closely. This is why it matters to someone in Wisconsin or Warsaw or Wuhan. The Iran-Israel rivalry is not a regional sideshow. It is a central engine of global instability with the power to reshape the international order. So where does this end? The honest answer is no one knows. And that uncertainty in a conflict involving nuclear technology, regional proxy armies, and two nations with profound survival instincts is itself deeply dangerous. There are those who believe that direct, full-scale war between Iran and Israel is now not a question of if, but when. The logic of mutual threat, unchecked proxy warfare, and nuclear ambition leads inevitably to confrontation. The covert war will eventually tip into something that cannot be contained. If Israel were to strike Iran's nuclear facilities, as it has threatened repeatedly, Iran has promised devastating retaliation. Hezbollah would launch its full arsenal at Israeli cities. The Houthis would fire at Israeli shipping. Iraqi militias would attack American bases across the region. A regional war could draw in the United States, drag in Russia and China through their proxy interests, and destabilize the global economy in ways felt for a generation. There are others who see a different path, who point to the Abraham Accords, the landmark 2020 agreements that normalized relations between Israel and the UAE, Bahrain, Sudan, and Morocco, as evidence that the Middle East's alignments are not fixed, who note that Saudi Arabia and Israel were edging toward their own normalization before October 7th derailed the process, who believe that a broader Arab-Israeli peace could isolate Iran, reduce the appeal of the axis of resistance, and eventually create conditions for a nuclear deal. And there are the people of Iran themselves, a young, educated, restless population that has shown in wave after wave of protest that they did not all choose this confrontation with Israel. The protests following the killing of Mahsa Amini in 2022 shook the regime to its foundations. At those protests, some Iranians held signs that said, "Our enemy is right here, not America, not Israel." The regime that built this rivalry is not the only face of Iran. It has never been. The most dangerous moment may still lie ahead. A cornered regime, a ticking nuclear clock, a regional war still smoldering after October 7th, and two nations, each convinced with some justification that the other represents an existential threat to their survival. History tells us that when nations reach this point, when the pressure is this high and the margins are this thin, the line between miscalculation and catastrophe becomes perilously thin. We began with a flame in a synagogue in Tehran, a Jewish community that has survived in Persian lands for 25 centuries, through empires and revolutions, through wars and ideologies, still there. History is long, and it contains more than we sometimes choose to remember. The Iran-Israel rivalry is real. The danger it poses is real. The weapons, the proxies, the nuclear centrifuges spinning underground, all real. The hatred that has been cultivated and amplified by leaders on both sides for political purposes at the cost of ordinary lives, all real. But the alliance that existed before the revolution, built on shared interests, quiet cooperation, and a recognition that these two ancient peoples had more that connected them than divided them, that was also real. The question is not whether Iran and Israel will always be enemies. History tells us they were not always enemies, and that human arrangements, however entrenched, can change. The question is whether they will find a way to step back from the edge before the edge finds them. From Cyrus to Khomeini, from alliance to enmity, from the ancient Persian court to the nuclear age. The fire is still burning. The only question that remains is whether it will illuminate or consume.